So I don't know about you, but one of the most haunting and difficult questions that I've ever wrestled with is why is it that God allows suffering in the world? We all come to that point where we experience suffering and we wrestle with that question. And there's really no easy answer. On the surface, suffering seems so unlike the character of God. It's so far from what we would expect from the nature. And as a loving and all-powerful God, you would think, would just change those things about the world that he didn't like. And so we often think about suffering as a lack as a blessing as a lack of suffering, and suffering as a lack of blessing. And that's usually about a pretty simplistic way to look at it, but that's often what we do. But Jesus, when he was put on the cross, he combined blessing and suffering. They were nailed together on the cross. Holiness and sin were nailed together and lifted up for the world to see. So we serve a God who is a suffering God. A God who is well acquainted with suffering, who took the form of man, came to the world, suffered, and died. So God doesn't sit up in heaven wondering about suffering. He doesn't look down on us and laugh as we go through these horrible trials that sometimes come into our lives. God is a God who suffers, who knows suffering, and who suffers with us. Imagine for a second emotionally what it would be like to be God. To have a heart breaking with love for the world, and to have a lot of people, most of the world probably, reject that love. To be waiting and hoping for people to find and seek you, and to just be rejected. God suffers. God suffers emotional heartbreak every moment of every day because of his love for us. So we find ourselves in these places where we experience trials and suffering, and we also can find our experience with God growing in those struggles. We can see God moving in that. We can feel God's presence in that. And every time we go through a trial, we're offered a choice. We can use it as an opportunity to be pushed toward God, to have our relationship with God strengthened, or we can use it as an excuse to turn away from God. We all go through that experience. Many of us have lost friends or loved ones. We have suffered mental and physical illnesses. We've come into a place where we suffer. And so many of us are probably suffering today. Whether we would ever talk about it in church, whether we would ever have the comfort level it would take to share. I mean, you saw open worship time, announcement to Joys and Concerns time so long this morning, because there's so much going on, and a lot of that's going on among our body is suffering. And so as we face trials, we have the choice to make about whether we'll take up our cross and follow Jesus and let our suffering pull us closer to God, or whether we'll turn away. I want to tell you a little bit about the audience that First Peter found in the first century. Peter, of course, is Peter the Apostle, who was Jesus' favorite, is always mentioned. Peter and the 12, he was called the Rock. Peter was the guy who really I find the closest connection to in the Bible. He failed big and he succeeded big. He was always chasing after Jesus. He was the only guy to walk on water besides Jesus. But he was also the first guy to deny Jesus. He was the first person to call Jesus the Christ and have that revealed to him by God. And he denied Jesus to a lowly servant girl. So Peter is quite a character. He's one of the few disciples who really gets a chance to speak and share their struggles and their failures. And I really connected with him. But he was a man who followed Jesus from his father's fishing boat and all the way to a cross. According to church tradition, at the end of Peter's life, Peter had preached all the way to Rome, and he was in Rome, and he found intense persecution there. And as he kept preaching and preaching, he was tempted to leave because he was facing so much persecution. And so he walked out of the city gates, and there someone who was Jesus in disguise asked him where he was going, and asked him if he was running away from his cross. And so according to church tradition, Peter went back into the city and just kept preaching and preaching and preaching until someone arrested him and he went through a trial. And as he was being crucified for what he was doing, he asked that they would crucify him upside down because he didn't want to die the same way that Jesus did, because he had denied him 3 times and felt guilty of it. So that painting behind me is the painting of Peter's crucifixion. He considered himself unworthy to suffer the same way that Jesus did. And so Peter is a man who followed Jesus from his father's fishing boat all the way to the cross. And as he's writing this to an audience who knew persecution, great persecution. After Stephen was stoned in the book of Acts, the church was dispersed all throughout the Roman world. And that was a major time of persecution, but later on, there was an emperor named Nero, who many of you have heard about from maybe history class, who was one of the worst Roman emperors of all time. And as Peter's writing this, the audience that he's writing would soon face some of the worst persecution that Christianity has ever faced. Nero would wrap Christians in animal skins and have them torn up by wild animals. What happened was Nero, he was playing with fire in his palace one day, and he burned it to the ground. And a lot of people think that he did this intentionally. Some people say it was an accident, but Nero was reportedly playing the lyre and laughing and singing and watching the palace burn. And this fire spread all throughout the city of Rome. It burned 2/3 of the city of Rome over the course of 6 days. And after the fire was out, somebody had to blame. Somebody had to fall for this crime that Nero had done. And so he blamed the Christians, which were a really easy group of people to scapegoat because they weren't patriotic. They refused to serve in the military. They refused to worship the emperor. They refused to worship the Roman gods of the time. So they were these really marginalized, undereducated people that everyone looked down upon in society. And so Nero blamed the Christians. And he began to persecute them worse than the church had ever seen. One of the worst things that Nero did was have Christians dipped in tar and crucified along the side of his raceway and lit on fire to light his races at night. This is the sort of persecution that Nero did. And so as Peter is writing to this audience, he's writing to them just in time for them to go through the greatest trial they have ever faced. But as we go through trials with Christ, it's an opportunity to grow closer to our suffering God. And we often want to be closer to God, but we don't want to chase down this path that leads to suffering. We don't want to see the side of God that comes through brokenness. We want to see the side of God that comes through blessings and comfort and security. So, are you in a fiery trial today? How do you know if you're in a fiery trial? I'd say a couple ways. A fiery trial will qualify for me as something that just cannot be ignored, something that won't go away. There's no way that you're going to deny your way out of a fiery trial. And fiery trials are these situations that heat up every aspect of our life and begin to melt us down. Many of us have been through experiences of intense pain or grief, or depression or loneliness, pain of mental or spiritual or physical pain. These things all can put us in this kind of trial mode. And so this letter, I think, is especially relevant to us today. Whether we're going into a fiery trial, going through a fiery trial, or walking out of a fiery trial, this letter has the words of life for us today. So, as we suffer through our trials with Christ, we receive great mercy from God, Peter points out. And hope is one of these greatest of mercies that we receive. I heard of an experiment that was done to test the effects of hope. And what they did was they took mice and they dropped them into a bucket of water. And they would watch the mouse swim and tread water. And they timed how long it would take for the mouse to give up and just drown. And most mice would drown about 7.5 hours after they started swimming in the bucket. And so to test the effects of hope, they would reach out at about 7 hours, they'd reach into the bucket and pull the mouse out for 10 minutes, give the mouse a little bit of a breather, and then throw them back in the bucket. I know this sounds completely cruel. This isn't the sort of thing you're probably thinking about hearing this morning. Not that many of you probably like mice all that much, but so as the mouse was brought back into the bucket, these mice who experienced being lifted out of their situation had hope, and they would keep swimming. Some of them would even swim for 24 hours straight before they gave up. I think that's what it shows us, that as we go through a trial, if we have hope in our life, if we have hope in Jesus, that he has mercy for us, that we will get through this and be closer to him, we can go through a trial. We can find the grace on the other side of that trial. We don't just give up in the face of it. Another thing that we experience as we go through trials is the joy of the Lord. That doesn't seem like something that would go together. Because we often think about joy like we think about happiness as something that's contingent on our circumstances. But joy isn't contingent on our circumstances. C.S. Lewis wrote, "We are all half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea." Really speaks to my condition, that idea that we're so quick to cling to things that aren't permanent, aren't from God. We cling to these things that are broken and dirty and filthy and distract us from God. Before I made a decision to follow Jesus and sacrifice these big parts of my life that I knew were a barrier to me following God, I ended up in this really bad relationship and ended up living with this woman that I never should have been in a relationship with at all. And my life just got kind of spiraled out of control for the course of a year as I lived in this rebellion to God. And I just had this real brokenness in my relationship with God because I was unwilling to listen to correction. I was unwilling to change anything about my life. And I kept sinking into bitterness and misery. And my girlfriend at the time, she started using drugs, and I was just in this, I had to get away from that environment. It was just toxic. And God gave me this mercy in the form of a church men's retreat at Twin Rocks Friends Camp in Oregon. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's this beautiful camp. There's these two rocks that just rise out of the ocean. And I got out of my situation like the mouse in the bucket long enough to see that it wasn't where I needed to be. I got out of the insanity of that situation. And I remember walking around the beach and listening to the seagulls and just resting in God's presence. And we went to this air museum. There's all these air museums in Oregon. Spruce Goose is in Oregon, for instance. But there's this huge one on the coast that was an old blimp hangar from World War II. It had all these German planes and World War II planes in it. And we walked around this beautiful museum looking at all these wonderful planes. I was a metal worker, so I was just marveling at the work that went into these planes. But I had never been in a plane before. And me and this guy, Jerry, walked away from that museum, and he was talking about all these times he'd been in a plane, and it came up that I'd never been in a plane before. I was 23 at that point, never had an excuse to be in a plane. We were driving past this pay-to-ride plane thing, and Jerry looked at me and he goes, "Today's the day." So he pulls us up to this plane ride. He paid $80 so that we could go up in a plane. And we went up in this World War II Spritzer plane. It had 2 steering wheels. It was this beautiful World War II plane. And the first time I was ever in a plane, I got to fly it because it had 2 steering wheels. The pilot let me fly it. I remember flying around this beautiful lighthouse and flying over this big rock out in the water with all these sea lions on it. I felt like a herd of elk. And I had this wonderful time of just being uplifted in my spirit, being free, having gone through a year of just the worst pain you can imagine, and then finding fun again, finding joy come breaking into my life. And even though I knew my situation hadn't changed, I began to find hope working in my spirit. I began to think that this stuff that I was going through wouldn't last forever. It was a real turning point in my life. And I went home and eventually turned away from this life that I was living. So directly related to our belief in Christ is our experience of hope and joy. but also faith. Romans 5, 3 through 4, which you read this morning, says, not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And rejoice means to express joy. That's something we can do even in the worst of circumstances. Whether we want to believe it or not, that our circumstances do not have to steal our joy away. Because it's permanent. It comes from God. It doesn't come from our circumstances like happiness does. So my last point is that as we suffer trials with Christ, we develop great faith in God. And there are many dictionary definitions of faith. Oxford Dictionary has a definition of faith. Webster's has a dictionary definition of faith. But the one I like the best is actually from the Bible. It's from Hebrews 11 that begins the so-called faith chapter. It starts out with this definition of faith. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. In verse 7, the Greek word for proving is dokimion, and it is where I found the inspiration of my series titled The Cross and the Crucible. In the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament that many people in Jesus' day read because Hebrew had basically died out, this was translated all throughout the Old Testament to refer to the purification of metal, and talking about faith in the context of being purified like metal. And dokimion is used of proving of something metal in a crucible. And a crucible is just a big melting pot that holds molten metal. And so these are images of fiery trials from the text. They go perfectly with this idea of being a crucible. And if as we melt into the pain of a fiery trial, it will take the shape of whatever it is that's holding us. If we let the world hold us, we'll take that shape. If we let Jesus' hands hold us, we'll be conformed to his image as we go through our trial. And there's a few things about molten metal, I think, that can teach us a little bit about our faith. We're open to change, because we have to be, because the pain of staying the same is smaller than the fear of moving forward to a new area. And so molten metal can be purified and refined and made into something new. It's not frozen and clinging to its impurities, but willing to let them be removed. And so it's easy to see fiery trials as something that as we melt, that we go through and have these impurities removed from us. But gold refining in the ancient world wasn't what we think of today. It wasn't this quick process of just heating up the gold and scooping off the impurities that floated to the top. That's not how they purified gold. Purifying gold is actually really hard. It takes all kinds of crazy methods today to get really pure gold. Those methods that they didn't have in the ancient world, like electrolysis and things like that. So in the ancient world, how they purified gold was they would heat it up to the 1400 degrees or whatever that it was. And a lot of the impurities were just burned up right then as the gold was heated up. But what they did was they would heat the gold up and they would add salt to it. And they would put it in the crucible and bury that in the sand for 5 days and let the heat continue to work on that metal, continue to purify that gold. So we see all these biblical images of light from the heat of the fire, of salt. And after they pulled it out of the ground, they would wash it hand by hand with water, with cold water. And all these biblical images of purification at work in this, as Peter's telling his audience about their trials purifying them. And so we want something that's quick. We want something that's just going to be over and done with and get us to this purified state of our faith. We want to just go through the trial rapidly and come out the other side with the benefits of it. That's not how it works. It's not how they would teach about that in the Bible. It's something that you just go through. It's a process. It's a process that as you go through, it causes you pain, but one that you have to have hope that you'll get to the other side. And so, but as we go through these trials, and as we go through this series about suffering and trials, I want you to be challenged on the idea that your trials are an opportunity to push you in the direction of Jesus or an excuse for you to turn away. So God has a benefit from this, even though it's hard to understand, even though we don't like it, even though it's difficult. There are blessings that come. We get stronger from going through these trials. and God's grace is there in spite of it. So as we go into our time of open worship, and before we go into our time of open worship, I want to challenge you to reflect on a time either that a trial pushed you closer to Jesus or pushed you away from Jesus. So if you would turn to your neighbor maybe for just a few minutes and briefly talk about one of those experiences that you've had with being pushed toward Jesus or being pushed away. And then we'll begin our time of open worship.